It started on a fresh morning of September. My friend Yu Jianhui and I were in Menglian, a sleepy town in the southwest of Yunnan. We were ready for a tea hunt, and today's objective was Lafu village, very close to the Burmese border, about 3 hours away from Menglian. We didn't know much about the place. It's one of those mountains that is unknown to the tea enthusiasts. Sometimes they can hide preserved gardens, left aside by the poor spotlight because of their remoteness. We heard about the place from locals at the detour of a conversation in a shady restaurant the last night. Rumors are spread in the tea circles about amazing tea growing here and there. When it comes to hunting tea gardens, the noodle shop, the grocery store, or the random taxi driver are all fair sources of information. After a quick breakfast, we headed south. After following the main road to Burma for an hour, we turned left and started climbing the mountains. We first went across extensive paddy fields, whose terraces we built over generations on slopes of this hard terrain. Groups of farmers in the fields and the distant roaring of the tractor engines hinted our trip wasn't going to fare well. It was harvest time. All the locals would be busy collecting the rice. We'd find only elders and children in the village. As we climbed up, the landscape of paddies was gradually replaced by large coffee plantations. From afar, they can be mistaken for tea gardens, but the coffee bushes are often taller and have a darker leaf color. We also came across cattle on the road. From these observations, before having seen any tea trees, we had some information about the nature of agriculture in this area. It was a sparsely populated border village with a diversified agriculture based on crops, herding, and cash crops. Not the usual prosperous tea mountain in which you'd find heavily specialized tea farmers. Moreover, we could only see small tractors and very basic equipment for the rice harvest. The farmers here didn't look very wealthy. As we reached the top of the mountain, the road winded through a forest and we crossed a small dam, a charming artificial lake on one side and a wide open hilly landscape on the other. We finally spotted some tea plantations, the unremarkable kind, young trees pruned at the mid-waist and well lined on terraces. No shade trees in the plots. This was really the most average plantation you could find in Yunnan. Yet, thanks to the high altitude of 1,500 meters, this place might still yield good tea, and the locals told us there were old trees in the area and good tea. We reached the first hamlet and stumbled upon what looked like a small tea factory. It looked really shabby, but after 3 hours of driving, we were thirsty. We stopped the car and entered the factory. A woman comes out of the nearby grocery store and welcomes us. A pile of fresh leaves is withering on the dirty concrete slab. Purple leaves, a special cultivar, quite common in Pu'er County. It's used for black tea and pu'er. She had 3 kinds of tea in storage: plantation, old tree, and wild tree, all pu'er tea. All of the dry leaves in storage smelt moldy and had an unappealing look. But hey, it's tea. We should give it a try. We settled on a messy table and brewed the leaves introduced as old tree's tea, as gusu. The tea was moldy, which killed the fragrance. Most tea enthusiasts would have dismissed it as absolute crap. But, there was some thickness in that cup. After a few cups of the unpleasant beverage, you could yet feel a decent sweetness in the throat. Despite bad storage and an approximate processing, the raw material seemed fine. We left the place and carried on. Now that our thirst was quenched, we could go ahead and look for some proper stuff. The woman from the grocery store told us that there were a few big tea factories around here, but as usual in rural Yunnan, it's hard to get accurate information on the situation. You have to ask a lot of questions and figure it out yourself. 2 kilometers further, we reached what seemed to be the main village, a nice-looking village, extremely well arranged. If you've ever been to a farm, you know there's mess everywhere. Here, it was tidy. Tidiness revealed us one thing. This village had likely been rebuilt by the government. This is a common outcome when the villages struggle. This was another hint that the area wasn't doing too well economically. We saw a more modern building that looked like a tea factory. You know, those with a blue roof and a concrete structure. We entered the courtyard. It was empty. Dead leaves all over the floor, broken windows, and spider nets on the ceiling. This place looked haunted. We left the car in the yard and took a walk around the village. As expected, we found no one we could talk to. Children, old ladies, and friendly dogs. Wait, what's that smell? Someone is making a rice wine here. We followed the fumes and found a steaming distiller. Besides it, a middle-aged man who greeted us. We first asked how the village was doing, and his reply was stunning. The last season, the tea factory that bought most of their leaves had suddenly closed down. The boss ran away without paying the farmers for their fresh leaves. He was referring to the factory we had parked in. He could speak fairly good Chinese Mandarin and sounded honest and eager to talk. We stood by the distiller and had a chat. Few buyers were coming to the village. This place is well out of the beaten path. This is no Jingmai or Laobanzang. In the last couple of months, they have been looking for new buyers. He went personally to Pu'er City and found new contacts there. Unlike in the famous mountains, the farmers here do not have the facilities to process tea. They only sell fresh leaves and rely on the large factories to market them. If one of them closes down, the price of the fresh leaves drops to a bare minimum. We then asked about the old trees, and his eye lit up and he cheerfully said, "This tea sells very well. I know a few private buyers who buy 10 or 20 kilograms of it each year." He started processing the old trees himself. He had 2 walks and a tiny rolling machine on the side of his house. Even if he sounded happy about the gushu business, he said he only processed the tea in early spring because he had no customers the rest of the year. He had no samples to show us, a sign of an inexperienced tea seller. This actually sounds good for us. People are not used to doing tea business, but some buyers are interested and come to the mountain. I got a good feel from him, and I could still feel the sweetness of the tea we had in the first factory. I told him I'd visit him again later in the autumn season. Maybe he could help me source good gushu leaves and we'd process it together in his walks. We asked him about the other factories, and once we had the directions, we left him to his alcoholic endeavors. We drove straight to the next factory on a small hill near the village. A pleasant smell of cooking tea was coming out of the dark room. The inside was cramped. 3 workers were sweating around big processing machines. We couldn't talk to them because of the mechanical noise, and they were quite busy anyway. They were making green tea. A first room was dedicated to withering, with double-decker mats. The second room was filled by a long shating machine, a rolling machine, and a coal-powered air dryer. That one was heating up the room like crazy. The dark room, the machinery, and the heat and sweat, it felt as if we were in the engine room of a steamboat. But I liked the design of this factory. It was a concentrate of tea making, cheap yet efficient. It was the perfect factory if you were to make tea for cheap in such a remote place. The boss showed up, a middle-aged woman wearing a Lahu ethnic outfit. We sat down and started talking about her operations here. She took out a piaoi bay and we brewed some of her tea in it. She was only making green tea. They sold it for cheap to poor wholesalers. My friend and I aren't into green tea, but she went on to tell us that she had just tried to make another kind of tea. She brought up a black tea. She made it 2 days ago. It was her first trial. That was good timing for us to visit. My friend specializes in black tea. He went into detail on how to process it properly. The tea we brewed had a muddy soup and lacked a complex fragrance. According to the expert on the subject, this was due to a lack of withering. When you make black tea, you have to wither the tea for much longer than for green or pu'er tea. If the leaves are not soft enough, they will be crushed during the rolling. The resulting muddiness is caused by the broken cells that float in the soup. The lack of fragrance was also related to that issue. The oxidation was okay, But we talked about more advanced techniques. The way you'll oxidize tea depends on how much tea you have. I have other videos on the subject. Finally, she dried the tea in one go. This is not recommended. Either you'll need to push up the time and temperature of the dryer, and your leaves will have a roasted taste, either they won't be dry enough. No, you need to give it a first drying to let about 70% of the moisture out. Then you let the leaves rest. The water that's remaining inside the leaves will slowly propagate to the surface of the leaf by capillarity. Then you give it a final drying. With this technique, you can dry the leaves with much less heat and therefore preserve the fragrance of tea. If you want your tea to be malty, as it is common in Yunnan, you can push up the temperature on the second drying. That will give it a light roast taste. Despite the shortcomings of this black tea, it had a thick body and a good character, which comforted me in the idea that this place can make decent tea. The boss took good notes of our observations and advice. She seemed really interested in processing good black tea. We talked for the best of an hour with this smart woman. My friend took her contact and we left. We had a quick junk food lunch at the grocery store and we went for a walk in the forest. Then came the happiest time of each tea trip. We finally stumbled upon beautiful old tea trees right there in the forest. I always get that adrenaline rush when I find ancient trees. It never gets old. We continued our walk on this small forest path and more tea trees greeted us along the way. We then walked through cornfields and in the middle of them we found these huge tea trees among the biggest I've ever seen, right among the corn. It's quite unusual to have old trees in such a setting. The farmers planted crops all around them. A sign that they are not well considered, possibly because of the lack of buyers and prestige. It was time to go back. We didn't get any sample of that mountain and only got to try 2 teas, but this was enough to convince me to go back for that gushu. We didn't see large surfaces of ancient tea gardens, which is actually good for us. It means the place is probably overlooked by the market, not because of poor quality, but simply because of the remoteness of the place and of the low quantities of old trees they have. Of course, you'd say that some very famous places also have very few trees. Mansong, Bingdao, Guafengjai come to mind, but these places raise to fame in a different context. They are located in areas that are known for tea production and in which many villages around them grow tea. The political support and potential for tourism also matter. For example, Laobanzong and Guafengjai are located in Xishuangbanna, and this area of Yunnan receives many visitors. Guafengjai is part of Yiwu, which is a historic mountain and which is quite a big mountain if you consider all the villages which are there. In the same way, Bingdao is surrounded by villages which produce a large amount of tea overall. But that Lafu town, in the middle of nowhere in Menglian, it has none of these attributes. Nobody is promoting their tea, nobody seemed really skilled at making high quality tea, but the trees are here, waiting to be harvested. So I love those tea trips because each one of them is unique. You never know what you're going to find. During this trip, we had a bad feel at the first sight because we couldn't see the tea trees and people were busy harvesting rice. But eventually, we collected enough information. I love when you build up a mental picture of the situation somewhere, and this picture changes dynamically with each new piece of information you acquire. The more observations you make, the more people you interview, the better the picture. There are 1,000 tricks that you will learn with time to better understand a landscape. Be observant, be open-minded, and ready for anything, and you'll be like Inspector Colombo in the Tea Mountain. That was our trip to Menglian in early September 2019. Thank you for watching.